Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to 11th grade and Unit 1 of 11th grade. Today, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at our first and one of our only pieces of poetry for this year. And for this little segment in the various text unit on poetry, all that I really want us to do is get another kind of instance of familiarity with poetry so that we can just feel comfortable with it because we may encounter it here and there throughout the year. We're definitely going to be encountering it in some form when we look at something like Shakespeare's work, like Macbeth. But in terms of like having a distinct unit on poetry, we're not going to have that this year. I instead just wanted to put it within our, various texts that we should be using to kind of increase our scope of reading comprehension, okay? And in that scope, yes, I want us to be able to read myths. I want us to be able to read nonfiction texts. I want us to be able to read short stories, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, poetry as well. So I've chosen this year to have us read just two poems. One very, very famous one, The Raven, right, by Edgar Allan Poe. We'll look at that in the next video. And the first one we're going to read in this video is an interesting little poem called Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I totally inserted this one because I'm a Tolkien fan. I'm a huge Tolkien nerd. And I thought it is a nice poem that we could look at just to give us a little bit of a break from what students usually are expecting or used to when it comes to poetry in high school, or even just content, narrative content in high school. And I'll explain, or we will see rather, why in a moment. Now, looking really quickly at the actual assignment that goes along with this reading, we have a mapping sheet, a poetry mapping sheet. And you can see that there's two columns here. There's three rows that are split into two columns with three different questions. What I'm going to have us do is fill out one half of the column for each poem that we read. Okay, so for Beren and Luthien, we're going to fill out this side. And then once we finish Beren and Luthien, we're going to read The Raven in the next video, and then we're going to fill out this side. And then in that next video, we're going to actually talk about how to do this comparative quick write. So we're going to be comparing the two eventually. But for now, what I want us to do is just focus on the narrative or on the poem itself of Beren and Luthien. Okay, so really quickly, normal rules of analysis. What do we look at first? We look at the title. What do we see in the title? Beren and Luthien. We assume that these are proper names. I don't know who Beren and Luthien are, right? We don't know, whatever. Like maybe you do know, maybe you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, maybe you're familiar with the Silmarillion and all the other, Tolkien stuff. If you are, good for you. If you're not, that's okay. That's fine, okay? So we have a story, or a poem, I should say, that is surrounded by a focus on these two people, okay? So whatever the story is going to be about, whatever the poem is going to be about, it's centered on these two, okay? Now, J.R.R. Tolkien, okay? What do we need to expect here from this author? Well, some of us don't know J.R.R. Tolkien, and some of us do. Some of us know him because, like I just said, he's the author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and some other fantastical works in the same world, in that world. And what do we therefore expect? We therefore should expect in Tolkien something to do with fantasy, some sort of fantastical elements. Okay, so what does the genre of fantasy usually entail? Well, fantastical elements, of course. Now, what do we mean by this? We mean magic, right? That there's going to be some form of magical things happening. There's going to be maybe some form of fantastical creatures in some way, shape, or form. For those of us who are more familiar with Tolkien, I might ask, which magical creatures would you really expect him to be writing about? And some people are going to, of course, say, oh, a hobbit, right? I know that in our school, we do read The Hobbit in 8th grade. So you might say, oh, yeah, it's The Hobbit, of course. But, another little bit deeper of a look into Tolkien, and you'll actually know that his preferred creature to write about, aside from the human race, is the race of beings called elves, okay? So something about elves, something with fantastical, magical elements, perhaps. Stylistically, if we're familiar with Tolkien at all, especially from The Hobbit, you'll recognize that he likes to write songs. He likes to write poetry that is meant to be sung, right? That does have poetic depth to it, that does have a sophistication to it, like we always want to talk about in English class, but it's also poetry that might be very appealing to us. So, for instance, this particular poem, Beren and Luthien, and I think pretty much every poem, not every poem, but the majority of the poems that you're going to find in Tolkien's writing were set to song by many fans and many people who tried to adapt his work. So I would encourage you, go check out, like, for example, there's definitely a song of Beren and Luthien on YouTube. If you just type in like Beren and Luthien song, it'll come up, right? There's definitely versions of this poem that are just sung by a more professional artist, okay? Okay, so this is what we can expect. Fine. Let's jump in with just those expectations. We can take a look, by the way, at the structure of this poem. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stanzas long, okay? 8 stanzas, and each stanza, as you will see, has 8 lines. A little bit of a nice structure there, kind of nice and symmetrical, okay? So, first stanza. The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels tall and fair. And in the glade a light was seen of stars and shadows shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there, to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair, and in her raiment glimmering. Okay. Pretty easy to read. This is something that we usually like about Tolkien, actually, at least with his poetry, because students will usually notice that, wait a minute, this is pretty accessible. This isn't very complicated, like we might think of other poems, right? Like Shakespeare. Shakespeare tends to be a little bit complex for students to break down, whereas Tolkien, like you can see here, is not 100%, you know, straightforward, because it's poetry after all. We're reading in verse, but he's a little bit more familiar to us, a little bit more accessible. What are these first 4 lines describing? Simply, I would say a nature setting, if you want. This is describing a scene in a forest, in a glade, right? A glade is a kind of opening, a lighted opening inside of a forest, right? Where there's usually like some grass and flowers, you know, in a sort of nice soft patch, quite open, right? Where the sun or the light from above the treetops can actually come through inside of a forest, okay? So a light was seen of stars and shadows shimmering, okay? Everything's nice, everything's beautiful. And we get then the next image of a girl. Tinuviel was dancing there to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair and on her raiment glimmering, okay? So right off the bat, Tolkien is describing what is supposed to be a very beautiful, a very magically or magically enchanting sort of scene here, okay? There's a lot of nature imagery. There's a lot of leaning into things like starlight, things like shimmering and glimmering, right? We can see the obvious rhyming there. And the images of stars, right, is kind of thrown in there twice now. So we have light, we have stars, we have greenery, we have the music of a pipe, right? Unseen, right? Like it's almost like the music is just kind of coming out of nowhere. And then we have this girl, Tinuviel, dancing. Okay. So beautiful scene off the bat here. The next stanza. There Beren came from mountains cold, and lost he wandered under leaves, and where the elven river rolled, he walked alone and sorrowing. He peered between the hemlock leaves, and saw in wonder flowers of gold upon her mantle and her sleeves, and her hair like shadow following. Okay, we get the introduction of our titular character, Beren. He's coming into this beautiful scene from where? From mountains cold. And he's wandering, or he's lost, right? And wandering, and he walked alone and sorrowing. Okay, so we'll talk about that third line in a minute here. So we got this guy coming from a setting that is negative, a setting that is uncomfortable, that is full of suffering, and he's carrying suffering with him, right? So we have a guy who's been through the ringer, a guy who's been through a rather negative experience in life, comes then into this place, and he walks by what's called the Elven River, right? And this is kind of where we get the introduction of some of the magical elements here. Whether it's the forest, whether it's the effect of the woman that we were just discussing, we're not sure, but we're going to see magic begin to kind of emanate from her setting, from the music, from all these sort of things. So Tolkien's magic, by the way, guys, as you can kind of tell here, is a soft magic system, as people would say. It's not clearly defined. We're not entirely sure where the magic is or what the magic or how the magic works entirely, but it's there. So he's walking, from this negative place, and he comes into this forest where Tinuviel is dancing, and it's described as an elver river that's kind of rolling through it, right? Well, if it's an elven river, we have to assume then the setting where he's coming into is an elven forest, is a forest, in other words, where the elves dwell. So we would assume, therefore, that Tinuviel, whoever this girl is also an elf. Okay. Well, again, as you're going to see in Tolkien, we don't think of elves kind of like elf on the shelf, little fairies in the North Pole. They're different than that. They're actually humanoids, right? They're tall beings. They're beings that are very like in structure and status to humans, but much, much more. Okay. So he comes down. He's miserable, right? He's sorrowing, he's been through some really negative experiences, apparently. He peered between the hemlock leaves and saw in wonder flowers of gold upon her mantle and her sleeves. In other words, he sees her, okay? He sees her through the forest, and what happens? He sees all the shadows and all this kind of, all the, her hair rather like shadow following. So he sees this beautiful image of her. Fine, fine, fine. The next stanza says, enchantment healed his weary feet that over hills were doomed to roam. And forth he hastened, strong and fleet, and grasped at moonbeams glistening. Through woven woods and elven homes she lightly fled on dancing feet, and left him lonely still to roam in the silent forest listening. Okay. So first four lines. Enchantment healed his weary feet. There's that magic, right? Something about the land he's in, something about her song, something about seeing her. Something is healing him. There's an enchantment in this place, in this girl, in the combination of the two, but in maybe his sight of her, maybe his feelings about her. We're not sure, but something is healing him that's being here. This is a place of life. This is a place of goodness. This is a place of beauty where he's coming to. And what happens? Forth he hastens strong and fleet. So he is running now closer to her. So he sees her and he's like, oh, and he like kind of goes even further and quicker and stronger towards her and grasped at moonbeams glistening, right? He's kind of like, reaching out to touch her, or reaching out, for her. Through woven woods and elven homes, she lightly fled on dancing feet and left him lonely still to roam in the silent forest listening. So what happens here? She runs away. She sees, this man in her elven home, and she leaves, right? She runs away. She doesn't know who he is, right? It's a pretty standard reaction. Sure. And what happens? He's left alone and listening for her, kind of just in the silent forest. So he's alone again, right? He's not doomed to suffer, as much as he was before. He's in a relatively pleasant place, but he hasn't attained the object of his desire, the person of his desire, this Tinuviel. Okay. The next stanza. He heard there oft, that is often, by the way, off the flying sound of feet as light as linden leaves, or music welling underground in hidden hollows quavering. Now withered lay the hemlock sheaves, and one by one with sighing sound, whispering fell the beechen leaves in the wintry woodland wavering. Okay, pretty standard stuff here, pretty simple. He's sitting around, he's listening, and he hears it's kind of like a condensation of, or condensement, I should say, condensement of time that's happening here. We don't know how long Beren is sitting around here waiting for her or looking for her, but we're told that, often he would hear the kind of sound of feet running around and music welling somewhere underground, like that pipe unseen music, right? Or maybe, singing in hidden hollows, quavering, right? So he hears music, he hears feet running around. He's not totally sure where she is. He's still looking around. Now withered lay the hemlock sheaves, and one by one with sighing sound, whispering fell the beechen leaves in the wintry woodland wavering. Okay, so now what's happening? Wintry woodland. So now the winter is coming. So he's been sitting here for a while, right? It was more spring or summerish before. Now, we're getting to winter, and the leaves and everything are starting to fall and starting to kind of fade into winter. Okay. He sought her ever, wandering far, where leaves of years were thickly strewn. by light of moon and ray of star and frosty havens shivering. Her mantle glinted in the moon, glinted rather in the moon, as on a hilltop high and far she danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering. Okay. The first four lines. Obviously, he's seeking her. He's seeking Tinuviel. He's seeking this girl. He's wandering around again through this forest, through this elven forest, where the leaves of years were thickly strewn, right? In other words, where there's a lot of age to this realm that he's in, right? It's a very old forest. He's kind of wandering through the ages, looking for this girl. And again, we get this in a nice nature description by light of moon, ray of star, and frosty haven shivering, right? So it's cold, but there's still light. So in other words, it's uncomfortable, right? It's winter, but it's still beautiful, right? There's something beautiful about being here. Her mantle glinted in the moon, as on a hilltop high and far she danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering, okay? So she's still around, she's still there, and her mantle, right? Her hair, her crown, her circlet, whatever it is that she's wearing, is glimmering in the moon. She's dancing on a hilltop high and far, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering. Okay, so it's this kind of like ethereal sort of image of her in the moonlight, in silver and white and dark sort of colors. She's dancing, in mist of silver, right? And it's like, okay, so she's like beyond his grasp still. Okay. When winter passed, she came again, and her song released the sudden spring, like rising lark and falling rain and melting water bubbling. He saw the elven flowers spring about her feet, and healed again he longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass and trouble him. Okay. So winter passes, she arrives, she comes again into the forest, okay, or at least into the area of the forest that he's in. Her song releases the sudden spring like rising lark and falling rain and melting water bubbling. So again, this kind of unclear magical effect or magical system. She's singing, and the effect of her song is to bring about the spring, bring about the end of winter, bring about the life of the plants, right? Rising lark, the idea of like life and song coming back, like in the lark birds, and falling rain, right? Like kind of the trickling of water now, not snow, but water to kind of, feed the plants, feed the world, and melting water bubbling, okay? So the rivers are starting to flow again. Everything is coming back to life. So again, you can kind of associate Tinuviel then, again, with a source of life, with a source of beauty and goodness and all this stuff. He saw the elven flowers spring about her feet. And so in other words, again, this idea that wherever she is, right, there's life kind of, budding up from her. And then what? And healed again, he longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass and troubling. So again, her effect is not just to heal the natural world from its slumber in winter, but it's also to heal his past ails too. So she is healing him here. She is the one providing some relief for him, for his long suffering and his long journeys and his long seeking of her. Okay? And an interesting kind of mythic or classical point here would be to point out the kind of motif or the trope, if I want to use the words we used back in our mythology discussion, that Tolkien is evoking here. He's invoking kind of the trope of the pursuit, the romantic pursuit, the romantic hunt, if you want, right? We see this very frequently in medieval and in mythic literature, whether it's a god that is pursuing a mortal, in a much more illicit way that we saw with Eros and Psyche, or whether it's a human being, what's it called? Chasing a semi-divine figure like a dryad or a naiad or a nymph or something like this. We see this kind of pursuit, right? The chase, as you want to call it, in more the modern dating world, right? We see it in the medieval poetry, right? The kind of the courtly love tradition where we are having people literally chase and hunt each other, right? I'm thinking, of course, of Gawain and the Green Knight. If you're familiar with that, which I think we're going to cover in our fantasy course. You should be familiar with this, especially because the Tolkien translated the Gawain and the Green Knight story, where the idea of the romantic pursuit is very present in that story. Let's put it that way. So he's invoking this idea, or at least this image. However, I think he's doing something kind of nice here. I think he's elevating it morally, or to use his language, he's sanctifying it, right? He's baptizing that image. So in the pagan world, of course, you would have a romantic pursuit that was much more sexual and much more illicit in its nature, right? The gods are chasing a mortal because they're aroused by the mortals, and mortal beings would chase and sexually dominate, or rape rather, these semi-divine figures like nymphs, for example. Tolkien is then taking that image and taking the image of his courtly love and pursuit that he has in medieval literature. And I think he is, again, to use his phrase, baptizing it. He's making it more legitimate. He's making it more wholesome for us. How do we know this? Because what he is saying here is that Beren wants to what? Does he want to go and rape this girl? That's not what he wants, ladies and gents. He wants, look, he says, or the poem says, the narrator says, he longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass untroubling. He is not looking for an illicit sexual relationship. He is looking for a true romantic relationship. He is looking to be with this girl and then experience all the bliss and romance therein. Very much like, Eros and Psyche, except here the roles are kind of reversed. It's a mortal chasing after, and not a divine, but at least an immortal, sort of higher being, a being kind of a little bit beyond our normal world. Okay, so he's chasing her legitimately, right? He wants to be with her. Again, she fled, normal as you would expect. But swift he came to Nuviel. He called her by her elvish name, and there she halted listening. One moment stood she, and a spell his voice laid on her. Beren came, and doom fell on Nuviel that in his arms lay glistening. Okay? So she's running away. He's running even faster again this time. He calls her now by her name. We don't totally understand how did he get her name. We don't know. Nuviel, he's yelling. And he's using the elvish term, right? Which is going to kind of get her attention a little bit more than just him running at her. Again, because language and names in have a power in them. They bring up familiarity, they bring up some sort of power, some sort of enchanting quality of their own. So he calls her name. That is what is able to kind of give her a little bit of a pause, right? And she stands there, and a spell his voice laid on her. Again, the idea of his voice, right? This just the presence of his voice is sort of laying a spell on her. Again, is this a nefarious spell? I don't think so. I think it's just something about his voice, very much like her voice was doing to him, kind of entrances her for a second. She's like, wait, I kind of like this guy's voice. So there's something fair about him too. I'm saying fair in the archaic way, beautiful. There's something beautiful about him and his voice, at least to her too. And it says, Doom fell on Nuviel that in his arms lay glistening. Now, of course, we're going to read doom in our more modern kind of context. We're going to think, oh, doom is something negative, right? Like this is her doom, like something is going to terrible happen to her. This is not how Tolkien means. Tolkien is again using the archaic term for fate here. The doom just means the fate. Like, so if I pronounce your doom, I'm just pronouncing your fate. Could be positive or could be negative, but it's still just your doom. Okay, we've kind of reworked that to mean something negative now, which fair enough, but like that's not how he means it here. So something about this experience lays Nuviel's fate on her, that in his arms lay glistening. So he's kind of holding her arms, or he's hugging her or something like this, and her fate now falls on her. Well, what is her fate? I think it's pretty clear. Her fate is going to be in love with him forever. Okay, so she falls for him. He's obviously fallen for her. As Beren looked into her eyes within the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies he saw there mirrored shimmering. To Nuviel the elven fair, immortal maiden elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair and arms like silver glimmering. Okay? Beren's looking into her eyes and the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies he saw there mirrored shimmering. Again, likening her to the skies, the stars, shadows in a beautiful way. To Nuviel, the elven fair, right? Immortal maiden, elven wise. Notice what he's saying here. She is elven fair. She's beautiful, like beyond a human kind of concept of beauty. She's immortal, right? So she's, again, greater in her lifespan and her experience, and elven wise. She has more wisdom now than he does, apparently, right? Just because of this. About him cast her shadowy hair and arms like silver glimmering. Okay. So she's, casting her hair about him, right? We have to assume that that's an image of an embrace, and her arms like silver glimmering, right? So they're embracing. This is an image of a romantic embrace here. Okay. Now, I like, let's talk about that later. I want to talk for a moment about the romantic dynamics that Tolkien depicts here. Okay. It's worth talking about. So we get the last stanza. Long was the way that fate them bore, o'er stony mountains cold and gray, through halls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade morrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more, and long ago they passed away in the forest singing sorrowless. Okay. So, first four lines, we get essentially a really big condensing of the rest of their lives up to a point. The next big section of their lives, we are not told. We are told they're meeting here. And then we get this kind of summary of all of their story after that. Long was the way that fate them bore. In other words, their story goes on quite a bit from this point on, and they go over stony mountains, cold and gray, again, kind of echoing where Beren had come from, right? So they go back into this troubled, dark, and dangerous world outside of that kind of comfortable, beautiful home they were in, through halls of iron and darkling door. Okay, so now, iron and darkling and all this kind of stuff, so really, really negative experiences, sure. And woods of nightshade, morrowless, right? So even darker forests, right? They've gone through, right? So they had a rough life after this. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more. So hold on. The sundering seas between them lay. Now notice what Tolkien does. He doesn't say just sundering seas, like any old sea. He's talking about a proper noun here. They're capitalized. What sundering seas is he talking about? Well, you could interpret this totally separate from Tolkien's narrative, I think, or you can pick up on the allusion he's making to his own writing. Let's do the former first. So sundering seas. Sundering means dividing, right? That something has been sundered, something has been torn apart, right? And it's a sea, right? It's something that we have a strong or have a very, very difficult time crossing. Okay, so something has divided them, and it's described like a sea. Okay. What does this mean? Do we interpret that literally? Do we say, okay, that's obviously like, she went to a different, country, right? She's gone and he's gone and they've been separated by this. Perhaps. I think you could look at that literally. You could look at it figuratively and say that there's something really great that has divided them. Well, what is he talking about? What is the great sundering, right? I think that's really clearly symbolic or referencing at least one of the greatest divisions of all, which is death. Okay, so death has divided them. Now, I lean into that figurative interpretation because if we want to now not look at it just on face value, if we want to look at it with reference to Tolkien's further work, we know the Sundering Seas in his other writings are essentially describing the sea that divides Middle Earth, Midgard, our world, from this other realm, this kind of Eden-like realm, this paradise realm where she goes to in other stories, okay? Or in his stories. So there's this divided world. There's the world, kind of the blessed realm, the realm where, the quote unquote gods and angels dwell, very much like the Garden of Eden. And then there's this realm where we are, where Middle Earth is, and where it's dark, and the elves dwell there too, but it's this kind of constant conflict with darker forces, okay? And that's where they've been divided. Okay, sure. So that's terrible, right? They've had this horrible life, and then they're divided by death, apparently. And yet at last they met once more. We have to wonder how. How did they meet again? Did they both die? Did one of them go kind of seeking her after death, and like Orpheus, kind of going into the afterlife? I think we're meant to kind of, again, because we're definitely referencing, if not just medieval, then also mythic images here. So this image of someone going to the afterlife, seeking their long lost love, or going through death to seek their long lost love, I think is something Tolkien very clearly has in mind. And long ago they passed away in the forest singing sorrowless. Okay? So they meet again, and then they pass away into a forest singing sorrowless. So after death, they meet again, and they pass away. They leave this world, or they leave this situation that they were in, singing sorrowless. Now, translate that. They lived happily ever after, is how that's describing. They lived happily forever after, right? Because this is, again, on face value, this sounds like it's after death, right? So, cue the Disney ending, cue the shining city on the hill, cue the couple dancing in the clouds, forever. I think that's kind of the image you're getting here. And again, if you want to know the actual full story of Beren and Luthien, go check out the chapter on Beren and Luthien in Tolkien's Silmarillion. It gives you a much more full narrative version of all this. But again, we're looking at the actual just poem here. Okay, so outside knowledge aside, what do we have here? We have here a very simple but beautiful romance poem, a poem about a man who was in a very difficult situation in life and who was suffering greatly, who wandered, apparently by accident, apparently by fate, into a realm that was much more beautiful and healing and wholesome to him. And he found there the girl of his dreams, the girl beyond his dreams. And what's even more is that her and just the quality of the area that he was in heals him, and then he pursues her successfully eventually, and she falls in love with him as well. They go through life together, and they live happily forever after. It's a beautiful story, right? It's the love story. It's just a quintessential love story. Now, a couple things here, just before we talk about our themes. I think it's interesting to note the to kind of sing Tolkien's praises here, the interaction between these two. You'll see that it's Beren who's suffering, it's the man who's suffering, and he is in need of the woman here. I think very clearly he needs to be with her. She is going to be the source of his happiness, of his healing, of his joy, and also of his, what would you say, salvation at the end. So you get an image of romance and love here as two halves, basically, that they need each other in some sense. We see that Luthien, falls in love with Beren as well and wants to be with him even unto death, right? Which is important for her because she's immortal, right? She's supposed to be somebody who doesn't die, and yet she chooses to essentially allow herself to die in order to be with him, okay? So tremendous self-sacrifice. Most of us can probably hear the ideas of Eros and Psyche echoing into this. And that's because it's the same, we're all drawing on the same idea, which is the nature of true love, essentially, is what we're getting here. Now, I like the interaction here that Tolkien describes between the two genders, right? We see that there's almost an equal quality of the genders. This is something that I think Tolkien does, which a lot of people don't notice, that he actually shows a very interesting gender dynamic between the two characters. Tinuviel is described as very clearly the more powerful one, and also very clearly the wiser of the two. And yet she still falls for him. And he is at least described as just the one who is in more need of her. So you have this, again, very medieval image of, the knight or of the man who is like painfully longing for this girl that he's in love with. And being with her is what's going to heal him, essentially. It's beautiful, right? It's a beautiful image, right? He's definitely, again, drawing on that gender dynamic that we see in medieval literature. Okay, so all of that summary aside, couple things. The rhyme scheme of the poem, that's the first thing we got to look at. So I'm not going to go through each stanza. Let's just look at the first stanza because they all follow the same structure, as you're going to see. What do we see with the rhyme scheme? Green, fair, seen, suffering. There, seen, unseen, I should say, hair glimmering, okay? Not a particularly clever, sequence of rhyming, but keep that in mind. But let's actually track it. Green, A, fair, B, A, C. So A, B, A, C for the first 4 lines. There. Did we see this before? Yeah. B, seen, A, B, C. So B, A, B, C. So we have a rhyme scheme that goes A, B, A, C, B, A, B, C. Okay. Bum, 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 bum. All right. So it's pretty what? Pretty rhythmic, pretty lyrical, pretty easy to memorize, right? When I'm in class, I usually just recite Beren and Luthien by heart because it's a pretty easy poem to sing, to chant. And that's, I think, what Tolkien is going for here. He's not going for some, long iambic pentameter kind of really complicated structure here, which is beautiful and elegant in and of itself. He's going for something quite sing-songy and quite simple, but also quite elegant as well, okay? What effect does this create on the poem, on the work? I think it's meant to sound like a song. It's meant to sound beautiful, right? It's meant to sound otherworldly. It's meant to sound just very, very accessible to us, right? So it's just adding to the basic beauty of the poem. Sure. 3 elements that Tolkien is using here, maybe the dominant 3. I think without a doubt, the easiest element that we can identify is imagery. Tolkien is just really not even leaning into imagery. He's like diving headfirst into imagery. And those of us who are familiar with his work, well, no, that's something that Tolkien does. He really, really loves imagery. Okay, so tons of nature imagery. To be more specific here, he's using a lot of nature imagery to kind of exaggerate, or I wouldn't say exaggerate, but really highlight the beauty of the scene that he's describing here. Okay, so imagery, sure. What else? I think you could say probably, I would technically say allusion, right? There's some very subtle allusions here with his use of tropes, with his use of kind of referencing tropes or elements from other, works of literature. That's a little bit of a deeper cut if you want to say allusions. That's always a more advanced element, but I would encourage you to try to kind of point it out here. What else do we see him using? We could say we see a little bit of conflict, right? We see the internal conflict of Beren. We see this kind of subtle conflict of him trying to find her, right? That's kind of what we're expecting and what we're hoping for. We see the use of a little bit of characterization, therefore, like I said, between the interesting gender dynamics there. Yeah, I would keep looking though. Keep looking to see what else you can see there. There's tons of similes there as well. There might be some metaphors as well too, okay? Now, more importantly, I think, beyond all the rest, what is the theme of this poem? Well, again, think of it this way, guys. If you're struggling to figure out a theme, like what an author is saying, one of the first places you should start is just by identifying those central ideas. Like, what are the ideas that he's very clearly focusing on? Well, I think Tolkien obviously is focusing on love. I think he's focusing on beauty. Okay, so love, beauty. I think we could kind of stick with those 2. What is he saying about love here? That it is going to have healing qualities, that it's going to enrich, enhance, quote unquote, save our lives. I think that's kind of what he's communicating here, that whatever damage we are dealt in life, whatever struggles we go through in life, I think it's love, or having love, is what is going to really kind of carry us through life. Which of course, is very similar to what we saw in Eros and Psyche. I think we're seeing the same sort of theme here, except, very differently portrayed. So yeah, I think that there's very clearly something like that to be said about love. That's a theme that we see here. Another theme to do with what? To do with beauty, right? The element of beauty. I think he's saying here that there's a link, or that there's something inherently beautiful about love and goodness, or that they are the same thing. And that the more beauty there is in life, the more enriched your life will be, the more healed you will be, the more positive effect that will have on your life. So beauty has healing and has a healing and very positive effect on our experiences in life, particularly after suffering or during suffering, right? So Beren, of course, comes from this very, very negative past, and he's kind of traumatized, we could say, right, from using psych language. And he comes into this world, and he experiences this entirely new, beautiful life in the forest here with Tinuviel, and that alone, or I should say, that combined with his love for her, right, the beauty of the realm and his love for her combined are what essentially heal him of his wounds, internal and external. Okay, so the power of beauty and the power of love, I think, are some really clear ideas that we can extend into themes in this poem. Okay, now last note before we end, because next video we're just going to jump over and do the Raven. We're going to read the Raven in a good amount of detail. It's as you'll see, it's a lot more complicated, I would say. It's a lot more difficult to access than Beren and Luthien, but still a great poem. Okay, so we'll get into that, and then we'll compare the two for a moment, and we'll talk to you about how to kind of approach that quick write. Now, again, I love to show this as just a last little kind of nerd Tolkien point about this poem, Beren and Luthien. Where did Tolkien come up with this idea? Well, if you go, like I have, thankfully, if you go to Tolkien's grave, if you make a pilgrimage to his grave site in Oxford, England, you will see on his grave, first of all, that his wife was buried first, Edith Mary Tolkien, and then after that, he was buried with her, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And beneath her name is written the name Luthien, and beneath his name, we see Beren. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean that that was actually their name? That was like their last names? No. It means that the story of Beren and Luthien was inspired by Tolkien's own meeting and relationship with his wife. Tolkien had married his wife Edith, but after going to World War I, and after suffering through World War I and coming home injured, he was being essentially nursed back to health by his wife. And there was actually apparently a moment or a day when she would, or I think maybe many instances probably, but one particular one where she brought him out into the forest or into the woods, into a glade, and she was singing and dancing for him. And this of course had a very romantic and powerful effect on him. So she was his Luthien, right? Wonderful, beautiful, cute little romance story there for you. All right, so that's Beren and Luthien. We'll take a look at the Raven next time, but in the meantime, have a wonderful, wonderful, lovely day. We'll see you soon. Bye.